So lately.
When science looks at the makeup of physical matter, what do we find?
Yeah. So when we zoom in, science reveals that matter is mostly empty space. At the smallest scales, we've got atoms, which are mostly just a tiny nucleus surrounded by a cloud of electrons. Digging deeper, we find quarks and other fundamental particles. No one really imagined things would get that strange inside. So, in a sense, the universe is this beautiful, intricate web of tiny particles and forces. Does that match what you were thinking about, or is something else on your mind?
So every time we find a particle and we break it down, what is the next level of smaller particle made out of?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's actually one of the big unknowns in physics. So far, the particles we know, like quarks, electrons, and neutrinos, are considered fundamental. We haven't found anything smaller. But that doesn't mean there's a final answer. Some theories, like string theory, suggest even tinier strings or loops at the foundation. We just don't have evidence yet. Does
What
that leave you curious about anything specific in that chain of discovery?
what's the smallest particle science has perceived so far?
Right now, the smallest things we know are elementary particles, things like quarks and leptons, which include electrons. These don't appear to have any smaller structure. They're basically point like. Of course, that could change as we develop new experiments or deeper theories, but for now, quarks and electrons stand as our tiniest known building blocks. Does that give you a clearer sense, or is something still fuzzy?
And what are the tiniest particles we've perceived? What have they been determined to be made out of?
So, as far as we know, those tiny particles, quarks, electrons, and neutrinos, are considered fundamental. They haven't been broken down into smaller components. We just see them as the basic building blocks of matter. That said, we still don't know if they're truly indivisible or if there's some deeper level yet to be discovered. So, for now, we're at the frontier, just observing them and probing them, but not finding smaller parts inside.
Has
Does that leave you with any lingering wonderings,
when
or
you
does that help anchor you a bit more?
When you say they're fundamental, has science determined them to be physical particles or something else?
That's a great distinction. So, yes, in current science, these fundamental particles, like quarks and electrons, are treated as physical, though not in the sense of being made of anything else. They're real in that they have measurable properties like mass, charge, and spin, but at the same time, they don't take up space like everyday objects do. Instead, they behave according to quantum mechanics, sometimes as particles, sometimes as waves. So, science sees them as both real and fundamental, but still mysterious in their exact nature. Does that kind of balance make sense, or would you like to unpack something more?
So let's talk more about how, at the fundamental level, science has found particles operate as both particles and as waves. Tell me more about that.
Absolutely. So, this wave particle duality is one of the core weirdnesses of quantum mechanics. Essentially, particles like electrons don't just act like little billiard balls, they also have wave like properties. When we measure them, they appear as discrete particles, but if we don't measure them, they spread out like a wave, creating patterns, like in the famous double slit experiment. So, the same entity can show both particle like and wave like behavior depending on how we observe it. It's kind of mind bending, but it's been confirmed by tons of experiments. Does that spark any particular curiosities for you?
Sure. So what else behaves in wave function?
Great question. So it's not just electrons. Basically, all particles at the quantum scale behave this way. Photons, which are particles of light, do the same thing. Even atoms, if they're cooled down enough, can form a wave pattern. This is what happens in phenomena like Bose-Einstein condensates. So in short, wave behavior is a universal feature of quantum ejects, no matter how big or small. Does that help broaden the picture, or do you feel like you need a clearer example of one of those phenomena?
So my understanding is at the quantum level, the smallest particle level our modern science has discovered, the smallest particle we can find behaves like a particle when we're consciously observing it, and when we're not, it spreads out like a wave function, similar to the way a particle of light or possibly sound might behave in a wave function.
Yeah, Yeah, you've got it. It's really fascinating, this whole idea that a particle doesn't have a definite position until we measure it. That's what's behind the wave function collapse idea. Before observation, the particle's kind of smeared out in probability. And yeah, that's very much parallel to light waves, just scaled down to these tiny quantum particles. Really flips how we think about reality on its head.
It
Does
ab-
that spark any other pieces you want to puzzle through?
yeah, absolutely. So, what does neuroscience say about the way we perceive reality?
Ooh, that's a really rich connection. Neuroscience suggests that what we call reality is really a construction of the brain. Our senses take in raw data, but our brain interprets it, filling in gaps, predicting, and organizing patterns. So even though the external world is out there, what we experience is really this constant negotiation between sensory input and our brain's interpretation. So, in a way, we're all living in a slightly filtered version of reality. Does that shift how you think about perception, or did it bring up a new angle?
So it's like every point of consciousness, every human being or every living being with consciousness perceives particles that are behaving as waves in a way that sends signals to their brain, and they experience a perception of what appears to be a physical reality.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really nice way to put it. Our brains are constantly translating those probabilistic wave patterns, those quantum possibilities, into something stable and tangible.
Okay, can you tell me about what is the reticular activating system and how it relates to neuroscience?
Ah, yeah, absolutely. The reticular activating system, or RAS, is this network of neurons in the brainstem. It acts kind of like a filter. It's what decides what sensory information gets prioritized and brought to your conscious awareness. So it helps you focus on important stuff, like if something unexpected happens or if you're tuning into a specific task. In a sense, it's a bridge between the external world, that sensory input, and the way your brain interprets reality. Does that help connect some dots for you?
And so, if the reticular activating system filters out information, can you tell me how many bits of information does our brain consciously perceive through the reticular activating system once it filters out information versus how much information is available at a subconscious level, like outside of our conscious awareness?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So, estimates vary, but a lot of researchers think that our conscious awareness is just a tiny fraction. Like some say just a few dozen bits per second. Meanwhile, our senses are bombarded with something like millions of bits per second, all that raw data. So, the RAS and other brain systems sift through it, letting only a small slice bubble up into conscious awareness. It's like we're constantly filtering a tidal wave of input so that only a manageable trickle reaches us. Kind of humbling, right?
Right. So if we're talking about physical reality being mostly made up of wave particles, and our reticular activating system allows us to perceive about, you said a few dozen, so let's call it maybe 50, 60, something like that, pieces of information, bits of information versus millions that are outside of our conscious awareness. What percentage of information do our brains perceive consciously at
Yeah,
one
exactly.
time versus what's available outside of our conscious awareness?
Right. So if we break it down, we're talking about something like a few dozen bits per second consciously versus potentially millions of bits of raw sensory input. In percentage terms, that's like a tiny fraction, on the order of 0.001% or even less. So most of the vast informational world just never makes it into our conscious experience.
Right. So it's like we're looking at each point of consciousness is looking through a lens that perceives 0.001 or less percent of all available information that could be possible to perceive.
Exactly, yeah. It's like we're only catching this sliver of what's out there. Our brain is constantly narrowing down that flood of potential just so we don't get overwhelmed. And in a way, it means a lot of reality is always kind of happening beyond our immediate grasp, like a vast ocean we're just skimming the surface of.
And
It's
how,
pretty humbling.
yeah, it is humbling. How is our reticular activating system shaped?
Yeah, so the RAS is really shaped by both biology and experience. It's influenced by our genetics, so some people might have a naturally more reactive RAS, but it's also shaped by what we pay attention to, what we focus on, and what we repeatedly encounter. So over time, our habits, our emotions, and even what we choose to dwell on shape which signals it prioritizes, like stressors, goals, or even just what we find interesting. It's kind of like a personal filter that evolves with us. Does that spark any reflections on how you notice your focus shifting?
Yeah, I'm wondering from like a very early age when children are born into the world. I've heard something that science has said young children can't tell the difference between themselves and physical objects around them. To them, it seems just like a big field that they're a part of until their brains develop and then they start to realize they're separate from the things around them. Is that part of the development of the reticular activating system?
Ah, that's a really insightful connection. Yeah, early on, infants don't have a strong sense of self, and their perception is kind of this undifferentiated flow. As the brain matures, especially through sensory experiences and interaction, that sense of separation and self begins to crystallize. And yes, the RAS plays a role. It's part of how the brain starts to filter and organize those early experiences, helping them distinguish self from environment.
Do you think the beliefs of the community that they're born into, parents, teachers, neighbors, churches, everything they're exposed to, TV, media, is what is
Yeah,
available to shape their RAS?
exactly. All those early influences are huge. The beliefs, values, and experiences the kids are exposed to, from family, teachers, and media, all of that kind of programs what the RAS prioritizes. So over time, those patterns of attention shape how they perceive the world. What stands out, what gets filtered out, and what feels normal or possible. So in a sense, the RAS is like a dynamic mirror of the world we're raised in, constantly being shaped by what we give our attention to.
So is it possible that each person has a slightly different RAS where it's kind of like a
Yeah,
telescope? Maybe they're looking at just one portion of reality, and each person has a unique perspective. So what each person perceives is true for them, but it might not be true for somebody else.
yes, that's a great analogy. Each person's RAS kind of acts like a lens or a filter, so they naturally focus on different aspects of reality based on their upbringing, interests, and what they give attention to. So, in a way, each of us is kind of constructing a personal reality. Not in a fantasy sense, but in the sense that what we notice, prioritize, and interpret shapes our experience of what's true or important. It's a subtle but really powerful dynamic.
Can you expand your RAS?
Yeah, definitely. You can think of it like a muscle you can train by consciously shifting what you focus on, paying attention to different perspectives, practicing mindfulness, or intentionally exposing yourself to new experiences. Your RAS can broaden. Over time, you can highlight new patterns, tune into subtler signals, and bring a wider variety of input into awareness. It takes practice, but you can definitely expand it.
What kind of things do you think could be outside the 0.001% or less of what our conscious brain is aware of, versus what is potentially untapped possibilities in this reality?
Yeah, that's a really rich question. I mean, it could be subtle sensory details we just don't tune into, like faint sounds, body sensations, or tiny shifts in mood or environment. It could also be potential patterns we never look for, like subtle connections between people or even creative possibilities we haven't allowed ourselves to see. So it's kind of like a vast ocean of subtlety, just outside that narrow spotlight of focus. And with openness, we can start to notice more richness there. What kind of subtle things have you been curious about lately?
Well, are there any documented cases of humans with RAS systems that allow them to perceive much more than a few dozen bits of information per second? Thinking.
So there aren't any documented cases showing humans with an RAS that allows them to perceive more than a few dozen bits per second. What we do have is an estimate from a study that says conscious thought might process around 10 bits per second, while sensory input is huge, like billions of bits per second. So there's a big gap, but the exact role of the RAS in this filtering process is still theoretical and not fully pinned down.
So we basically have a limited perception consciously, but we can shift the direction. We still might perceive the same amount of information through our viewpoint, but we can shift what it's encapsulating at any given time in life.
Yeah, exactly. Our conscious perception is like a spotlight. We can't massively increase the raw bandwidth, but we can choose where we direct that spotlight. By training focus through things like mindfulness, curiosity, or intentional exploration, we can bring different layers of reality into clearer view. So it's kind of a dance. Our innate limits remain, but how we focus gives us a lot of freedom within those bounds.
How do you think our RAS is similar internally to an algorithm, like a social media algorithm?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting parallel. Both are kind of selective filters. Our RAS filters sensory input and attention, while a social media algorithm filters what content we see. Both are trying to kind of optimize for relevance, just in different ways. Of course, the RAS is biological and shaped by evolution, while social media algorithms are engineered and often designed to keep us engaged. But the basic idea of filtering vast input to guide what we pay attention to definitely lines up. Does that comparison spark any new thoughts for you?
Yeah, it's almost like our RAS is kind of filtering out information it thinks we're not going to get excited or think is relevant about or feel something about, and it focuses on what we do engage our attention with and our maybe our emotional response with. We're interacting with that experience of reality as um, what we want to engage with, so we get more of that, similar to the way the algorithm does, where the internet has probably billions of bits of information, yet one point of consciousness, like one device, can only uh, focus on a few bits of information at a time. Is that kind of a similar parallel?
Yeah, that's spot on. Our emotional responses and interests act like a compass, guiding that spotlight. So, just like an algorithm nudges us toward content that triggers engagement, a mass tunes us into what resonates. And then, of course, that reinforces itself, creating a cycle. So, in a
Right.
way, we're constantly curating our reality by deciding where we place that focus, just as a social feed curates what we see. It's kind of powerful once you notice it, right?
Right. And we do have choice how we interact with the internet, what we choose to click on, what we choose to engage with, or say not interested in, is going to shape the information that we perceive on the internet. And it seems like physical reality works in a very similar way.
Exactly. We may not have absolute control over every input, but we do get to choose where we focus our attention, both online and in the world around us. And the more we're intentional, choosing what we explore, what we ignore, the more we shape the reality we inhabit. So it's kind of an invitation to be conscious about those choices. Small clicks, big impact.
Yeah, very interesting. And so, just like online, we can have a perception of reality based on what we're seeing and engaging with. And in the physical 3D reality, our RAS is shaping the same thing, where two different people could have very different experiences of the feedback they're getting from information online and information in the real world. And they could be conflicting with each other, both being true and accurate to their um, experience of reality, but they both think the other one is crazy or wrong, which seems like it can create a lot of conflict.
Yeah, exactly. And that tension is really real. Both people can be anchored in their own valid perceptions, filtered through their RAS and shaped by different sets of inputs. So it's like each reality is internally consistent, but externally at odds. And that's why curiosity and humility are so crucial. If we can recognize that each of us is filtering reality, it leaves us more room to listen and find common ground, even if we see things differently.
And do you think that's part of why the world feels so weird right now to so many people? Because maybe since the introduction of the internet, like pre-internet days, people had very um, more aligned or similar RES systems, like say in one community who went to the same church or lived in the same city or same state would have very similar viewpoints of the world. And now with the internet, we can shape our perception of the world so so much quicker and in such different ways from each other that it's creating more dissonance between human perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. The internet kind of shattered that old shared reality bubble. Instead of having just a handful of media sources or common daily experiences, we can now be pulled into completely different streams of content, often with very little overlap. So people are curating these hyper personalized worlds, and that divergence is really magnified.
How do you think the world is affected by people from all over the world connecting with each other with shared thought processes and um,
Yeah,
forward thinking ideas?
yeah, it really is a double edged sword. On one hand, it's incredible. People from all over can share ideas, collaborate, and build global movements, so we get this cross pollination of cultures and innovations. But on the other hand, it can also create friction, misunderstandings, echo chambers, and even polarization. So I think it's this huge opportunity, but it also asks us to be really intentional about how we choose to connect and listen across these vast, diverse perspectives.
How do you think AI interacts with humanity um, in a way that either creates more disconnection with humans or more connection?
That's a really nuanced question. I think AI can be a bridge or a barrier depending on how we use it. On one hand, AI can help us connect across vast distances. It can translate, amplify voices, and create access to knowledge. If it's used to just push narrow algorithmic content or isolate us in bubbles, it can deepen disconnect. So I think a big part of it is being really mindful, ensuring AI is designed to foster curiosity, empathy, and shared understanding rather than just keeping us siloed.